Well, on the oil caper, it starts with the oil proration laws. Oil proration laws began in America in approximately 1931-32, when enormous oil fields were discovered. Vast and superabundant oil fields were discovered in Texas and Oklahoma, the great Texas-Oklahoma find, as a result of which the price of crude oil plummeted straight down. The oil industry got rather hysterical about this and called upon the state for bail them out. This is known as a partnership now of government and industry. Not all oil men, but enough oil men to count. So the classic cartel situation comes into practice. The first thing the government did is they outlawed all further production of oil until we can straighten the whole thing out. They call it an oil moratorium. And to enforce the moratorium, the governors of Texas and Oklahoma declared martial law and set the troops out into the oil fields. Especially because at night, you see a lot of the guys were wildcatting, drilling their own oil and taking the hot oil out. And so they came in with fixed bayonets and guns at the ready to shoot all any wildcat oil driller who was drilling his own oil, getting out of the ground and shipping it out. They did shoot some people. The governor of Oklahoma was the colorful Alfalfa Bill Murray, Wild Bill, Alfalfa Bill Murray. So there was an oil moratorium that straightened it, stop production. First thing they did, stop that. And then the states and the federal government collaborating set up oil proration laws. The oil proration law works something as follows. In Texas, for example, which is the largest oil state, there's a old geezer, usually a retired general, who's the head of something called the Texas Railroad Commission. As far as I know, it has nothing to do with railroads. It's only involved in setting maximum oil quotas. So every month the old geezer decides how much oil is allowed to be produced next month, and he said, okay, from now on, next month, you can only produce whatever, million barrels of crude oil. And then each oil well in Texas has a quota, like, you have 0.005% of the oil in Texas, and then you're restricted to that. So in other words, the supply curve of oil is pushed drastically to the left. The price of crude oil is raised. This, of course, pushes the supply of gasoline and heating oil, all the stuff that comes out of crude, to the left and raises their price. This has been going on since 1932, and every month the old geezer puts out this maximum quota. And the excuse for this, for an economist, the excuse for this is laughable. They'll say, well, we need the Texas Railroad Commission to do this because they have to adjust supply to demand. That's what the market's supposed to be doing, adjusting supply to demand. No, they need this because otherwise what? Otherwise too much will be produced. And the price of crude oil will fall, we can't have any of that. So that's the first chronic thing, a very basic chronic thing that raises the price of crude oil and limits the production. Now this has been done in the name of conservation. I'll get to that, the conservation caper later on. But it's done in the name of conservation. Well, we want less to be produced because then the future generations will have it, all that jazz. However, along with the oil proration laws came oil import restrictions. Keep foreign oil out. If you're really interested in conserving American oil, keeping all that oil in Texas, then you want to encourage the importation of foreign oil like mad, right? Right. However, they did not. They kept out foreign oil, thereby shifting the supply curve of oil to the left, starting with tariffs, winding up with oil import quotas. So in order to import oil, you have to buy somebody else's quota right. So in other words, if Shell Oil had 10% of the imports in 1950 something, whenever this thing came in, if you're a new oil importer, you can't import oil. You haven't got the right. It's illegal. You have to buy the 10% or the 2% from Shell at a high price. This, of course, keeps out competitors and keeps the oil imports from coming in. This, I think, has been repealed about a year ago. But the point is, this has been the basic policy for quite a while. So this, that's the restriction on domestic and foreign oil. And then in addition to that, the federal government of the United States is sitting on an enormous amount of oil. Enormous! It's been sitting on it for 50 years now, and nothing has been done with it. This is called conservation or something. It's called withholding from the market, thereby raising the price. There's the Elk Hills Reserve, I think in California, which has God knows how many billions and billions of barrels. And there's the Teapot Dome, which of course is a famous case in American history, where the poor guy was crucified because he wanted to at least get the oil out. Sure, he might have been a crook, but at least he was trying to produce some oil. Well, finally, President Nixon's latest speech, he's you're going to start producing a little bit from the Elk Hills Reserve. But the point is, it's been kept off the market all this time, thereby raising the price of crude oil and the price of gasoline and the whole business and restricting the supply. Then in addition to this, and this goes for all the shortages, I haven't got time to go to the other products yet. There are the environmentalists, crazies, as I like to call them, who have now stopped with absolute determination and will, have tried to plug the gap and try to restrict production anywhere they can find get their hands on. So as a result of this, oil refineries can't be produced for several years because God knows why. They pollute the air, or they deface the landscape, whatever. So this is cut down on the production of oil refineries. Also, of course, the Alaskan pipeline, which would supply about 2 million barrels a day, which is pretty hefty, has been held up for many years because of the environmentalists. They're finally getting going, but it's been held up for many, many years. As far as I can make out the Alaskan caper, I've done some reading on the Alaskan question. The environmentalist problem seems to be twofold. One is the deface the landscape. In other words, the beautiful, unmarked by man, that is, plateau and steppes and whatever they got up there in Alaska would be defaced by the fact there'd be a pipeline running through it. It's really tough. And I noticed the logical implication of this, and if the environmentalists had been in control in 1776, we'd never have anything beyond, a little fort here on the tip of Manhattan. Because you couldn't chop down a tree, you couldn't do anything. So that's one problem, the scenic problem, which is something I do not find a grabber, let's put it that way. And the second problem is the caribou. The caribou like to walk across the tundra. And if you have a pipeline, which has to be dug down deep because there's a thermal whatever, heat in the soil, then the poor caribou wouldn't be able to walk across and be confused when they die out. I swear, that's then the oil company said, okay, we'll build a ramp, we'll get bridges across the pipeline so the caribou can walk. But then they said, well, yeah, but the environmentalists said, who knows? I mean, maybe the caribou wouldn't like the bridge, they like the tundra, they wouldn't walk across it. And for this, we have to suffer and not have any gas rationing. The Alaskans themselves are rather annoyed at this whole thing. The editor of the Anchorage Daily Times wrote a letter and said that of the 300,000 people in Alaska, at least 299,000 are very bitter about this holding up the Alaskan pipeline. And the other people, he said, the other 1,000, quote, feel a kinship with all the kooks who want to lock up Alaska as some sort of permanent wilderness. It's pretty clear that people in Alaska don't want to live in a permanent tundra. Okay, so that's the oil caper. Then a very related sort of thing is for example, the crippling of natural gas and coal. Natural gas is a substitute for oil and heating, etc. Well, natural gas for the last 25 years, for an obscure reason, at least obscure to me, has been regulated, the price of which has been regulated at the wellhead and interstate commerce by the Federal Power Commission, way, way below the free market level. Of course, as inflation proceeds, it's even further below. Now, why it's been done that way, whether it's been done for ideological reasons or because the gas buyers want it, I don't know, or a combination. But at any rate, this has created an increasing shortage over the years of natural gas, especially in interstate commerce. There's plenty of natural gas in Texas itself, and Oklahoma, because there's no price control intrastate. The result of this, there's lots of natural gas reserves. Everybody knows there's lots of natural gas under the ground, but nobody's looking for it because it doesn't pay anybody to look for it because the price is held way below the free market. As a result, there's an increasing natural gas shortage. As the natural gas shortage, people turn to oil. So you have a cut in the supply of natural gas, an increase in the price of oil, increase in demand for oil artificially, which adds to the oil problem. And created a fuel oil, the heating oil shortage, I should say, for last year, and it will continue. So natural gas is crippled. When natural gas is artificially crippled by the government, this raises the demand for oil, and this adds to the oil shortage. Same thing happened to coal. Coal has been crippled in many ways. There's lots of coal around, too. Lots of coal. Coal has been crippled in several directions. First place, John L. Lewis, the beloved leader of the coal union for many years, was a very good economist. He understood exactly what was going on. He knew that if unions pushed up wage rates, it would cause unemployment. He knew that very well. He was a brilliant economist. On the other hand, he was in favor of it. Since he was in the union and his comrades were union members for a long time, he said, okay, we'll disemploy them. I go, hell with them. They're not union members. They're apprentices or whatever. As a result of which you have and they did this in collaboration with a lot of the large mine owners who wanted to disemplloy their smaller competitors. As a result of which you have a deliberate policy of a mine workers union for many years, since the 30s, to cripple the coal industry, to shift the supply curve to the left, to raise the wage rates for those remaining, those oldsters still in the coal business. Everybody else is in Appalachia living as hillbillies or dropouts, forced dropouts in Appalachia. Well, this cuts a lot of the coal supply. That's one factor. Second factor is the environmentalist crazies back again in two directions. One is hysteria over strip mining. Now, strip mining is quite cheap. It's 40% of the domestic coal mine is strip mining. Now, there is a problem with private property of the farmer down the hill in strip mining, but the basic I think charge seems to be aesthetic. The strip mining causes an ugly landscape. The hill is grooved forever, or whatever it is. Again, this is not the sort of thing problem I find a grabber. I think it's more important to have coal or fuel for the cities and factories than there is to worry about the Kentucky hillside. At any rate, the strip mining hysteria caused lots of laws to be passed to restrict strip mining, cripple it, and so forth. And the second environmentalist thrust there was the air pollution. Dirty coal is a dirty fuel. Sulfur is poured into the air, and so forth. And then the Clean Air Act of 1970 Federal Clean Air Act drastically lowered the supply of coal, which means people have to shift to oil for heat, which raises the demand for oil, and again you intensify the oil shortage. Now, I'm not really in favor of air pollution. I don't know much about it. I think the public media has been one-sided in the fact that we've only heard the environmentalist side of the story. The anti-environmentalists claim that the sulfur really disappears pretty quickly and doesn't really harm anybody. But at any rate, certainly the restrictions came on awfully fast, let's put it that way, and awfully suddenly, and awfully severely, and again causing these effects. So coal has been crippled, natural gas has been crippled by government action, and also electric power. Electric power been crippled. First of all, utilities can't build nuclear power plants because people are worried about nuclear radiation, etc., although the experts claim there's no real problem. Secondly, they can't, for example, Con Edison has been trying to build a Storm King plant for God knows how many years up the Hudson. The environmentalists have stopped it because it ruins the Hudson. The Storm King mountain view is spoiled. Again, it's not something it's not an argument to which I feel I can do full justice. So this has stopped the Storm King plant for many years. Presumably they'll finally get it, but it's held the thing up a lot. Cuts down supply of electricity, raises the price, etc. Increases the energy shortage. And finally, there's the whole problem of electrical utilities anyway. Electric utilities are compulsory monopolies. You can't compete with Con Ed. Con Ed has a monopoly. Each electrical industry firm in this area has a monopoly granted to it by the government of its area. You can't go into competition. You have a compulsory monopoly. And secondly, you have a fixed rate of return guaranteed, fixed rate of profit guaranteed by the government. So the rate is set by the government action. Fixed pleasant rate of profit is set. That's very high. On the other hand, it's guaranteed. So this makes a big difference. So it means there's no competition in the electrical industry. It means there's research and development and all sorts of technological improvements in the electrical industry is cut out, is eliminated, it's restricted. And also, the way the rate is set is there's a fixed rate on return of capital. In other words, let's say 6%. So this means that the rate is set in such a way you get a certain profit per amount of capital. This means the higher your capital, the better off you are, regardless of whether the capital is any good or not. As a result of this, the electrical industry hardly ever depreciates its equipment. It depreciates equipment very, very slowly. Because why do it? If you have your $10,000 machine, which is half dead, so to speak, doesn't make any difference. It's worth $8,000 on the books, and you'll get your profit rate determined on that basis. The result of which is that while IBM, for example, a very progressive company, depreciates its equipment very fast, say in 10 years, AT&T and Con Ed depreciate their equipment over 50 years. Hang on to their obsolete equipment until the last possible ounce of squeeze out of it, thereby again repressing and restricting and crippling technological developments and improvements and productivity in the utility industry in general. Well, that of course adds to the energy shortage. Well, as we have political rationing, as I say, we'll see congressmen voting themselves the unlimited supply of gasoline and so forth. We'll also see, we're also already seeing rationing of airline flights, which is a beautiful cartel arrangement where the government, the CAB, Civil Aeronautics Board, tells the airlines, got to cut out your airline flights. And the airlines, of course, receive this dread information with enormous enthusiasm. Since they've been competing, even though their competition is fairly limited, as we'll get to later on, by the CAB, by the existence of the CAB, still they were competing, and they found out that not every flight was like a cattle car, and there was even some empty seats. And so we're now, boy oh boy, we're patriotically going along, we're cutting out half our flights, and every plane will be packed. So once again, you have the government as cartelists, restricting airlines' competition, service, etc. But we'll get more to the airlines and the cartel thing later. I'd like to wind up this homily on price control and rationing. A little quote, if I can find it. Yeah, from a column of a journalist who is not let's put it this way, he's not distinguished as an analyst or as a knowledgeable on the market, but he's got a great spirit, especially in relation to the government. This is Pete Hamill's column of Monday, New York Post. Just a few lines from it. He's reacting viscerally, instinctively, I think correctly, to the government blackout, and the energy, the gas rationing, and all the rest of it. He says, now they've even taken away our skyline. It had been hours since that day in 1945 when we all raced to the rooftops of Brooklyn to see those million lights blink on again, dazzling, joyous, triumphant, and unbelievably beautiful, signaling to us that the war was over. I remember a woman crying on the rooftop that time, knowing that the long night of the Second World War was finished, that New York was blazing again with its electric beauty, the blackouts and dim outs were behind us, that the troop ships would soon be home, the New York skyline, ours forever. And now it's gone again. Moving along the city's highways, there's a joyless sense of defeat and loss in the town. It's as if the malignant hand of Richard Nixon had reached out from the bunker in Camp David and pulled the light switch on all of us, spreading his personal darkness. The Empire State Building is a blinking red light in the dark. A great pile of downtown buildings, Truman Capote's diamond iceberg, is a hole in the night sky. And by the end of this thing, he says, we are overdue for a rebellion against the corrupt criminal government in Washington. And now we have one opportunity to make that rebellion overt. Turn on all your lights. Drive 65 miles an hour. Will Rockefeller order airstrikes on the thruway to stop us? Refuse to turn down thermostats. Let Washington know we've made them again for liars, and let's get back our skyline. There's a lot of shortages instead of just the energy shortage. Incidentally, on the energy, footnote on the energy shortage, the latest thing is that they're planning to outlaw, not just have gasoline rationing, but they're planning to outlaw Sunday pleasure driving. And we're getting back to the World War II thing, the horror stories I was telling you last week about OPA spies checking up and see if you're parked near a movie, which would imply that you were on a pleasure trip. Well, it's the same sort of thing. How are they going to enforce this? If they try to enforce outlawing pleasure driving, there's going to be a vast Gestapo wandering around making sure every car on Sunday is really going back and forth to a hospital, and everything else is going to be clamped down on. And then they figure, well, maybe it'd be easier to enforce it by just simply closing down all the filling stations. So you won't be able to get gas on Sunday. So I suppose it's a cute trick. On the other hand, what happens to the so-called essential driving? That you're traveling 100 miles to the hospital in an emergency, you run out of gas, and gasoline has been outlawed. Well, I guess it's just too bad. Instead of allowing the price system to ration the so-called scarce material. So we're getting more and more to that sort of situation. There are other shortages too. There are several shortages I might mention now. There's steel. Steel
steel suffered from steel was surplus. Only a few years ago there was a big so-called surplus of steel. A few years before that, there was a so-called shortage. So things happened obviously very rapidly in the steel business. What happened with the steel industry is that there were severe Phase 4 price ceilings. That's the current price ceilings. There have been severe Phase 2 and 3.5 also. The result of all of which was that the price of steel has been held way below the free market price, and as a result you have a steel shortage. The Cost of Living Council, for example, in its wisdom, refused to grant a price increase because the excuse was, the profits were high. If you look at the profit ratio, you say, hey, the profits are pretty high, especially compared to 1969-70 when there was a recession. The profits have increased quite a bit. Then you say, well, we don't allow the price increase, not realizing, of course, that the whole point of prices moving up and down is not to allow a rate of profit, but to allocate supply and demand in accordance with our market clearing, no shortage, no surplus setup. As a matter of fact, the thing that just happened today, November the 20th. Today there was a latest issue of Human Events has come out. There's a long report of a speech by C. Jackson Grayson and C. Grayson Jackson. I always mix that up. Who only a short couple of years ago, was the head of our august price control program. He's come out in a blistering attack on all price and wage controls, saying it won't work, it causes shortages, causes hidden upgrading of workers, all the sort of stuff I've been telling you here. So, unfortunately, all these guys get great when they're out of power. When they're in power, they're so hot. The same thing happened some years ago. Only the older citizens here will remember this. There was a gentleman who was the head of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, named T. Coleman Andrews from Virginia. After he retired from the IRS, he stumped the country from then on, attacking income taxes, going for the repeal of the income tax amendment. So, let's say, out of power, I guess they learned from experience or something. There's also a great statement that I found from the Executive Vice President of American Standard Incorporated, a certain Bryce Durant, who said, quote, as long as we have price controls, it's hard to assess the true price and availability of alternative materials. It's like playing with cards when you can't read the numbers on them. The summation of what happens when there's no price system, no freely fluctuating price system to allocate resources. That was the steel problem. Also, of course, there's a big shortage in paper. Really big. My brother-in-law happens to be a printer in the South, and he has enough paper only because he stored up a lot of paper. He squirreled away a lot of paper over the last 6 months or a year because he saw a paper shortage emerging. The problem, why is there a paper shortage? Well, for several reasons. One of the biggest factors, again, price controls. What happens again, you see, when the phase 1, 2, 3, and 3.5, etc., came in at a time during a recession when profits were low and so forth, and then the prices were then frozen in at the very low profit margins, and then profits go up, and the government says that's a terrible thing. Profits are now increased. We won't allow you to increase prices, and so we're stuck with a paper price way below the free market. And this generates a famous paper shortage. There's no shortage, by the way, in lumber and plywood, only in the paper part of the industry. What happened in lumber and plywood is a healthy falling off of residential mortgages because of the building crunch in 1973. So that's and the interest rate going up. So the shortages are a function again of the price control setup. Again, not exactly creating a shortage, but causing paper to be much less plentiful supply, declining supply. Again, we have very, very heavily in the picture the environmental crazies, whom I mentioned last week, who, because paper is certainly probably the most polluting of all industries, and so there's a massive closing up of paper mills. All the old paper mills in Wisconsin and other areas, New England, etc., were shut down, and of course that led to a dropping off, a shift to the left of the supply curve for paper, which of course created more of a shortage if you have, because of the free market price then became even higher. I thought of a bon mot in a speech I gave last week on price controls. which I may as well use here also, which is that explaining the difference between scarcity and shortage, between the shift of the supply curve to the left and a shortage, which means you can't get anything regardless of the existing price. Rembrandts, for example, are very, very scarce. Nobody ever talks about a Rembrandt shortage. I mean, if you want to buy a Rembrandt, they're always available for the $2 million or whatever you want to kick in for it. The point is, even though very, very scarce and not likely to increase in supply, nobody worries. There's no griping about a Rembrandt shortage because you pay the free market price, which balances supply and demand. Also, there's a cement shortage, which, again, the two things involved. Again, we have almost a litany here. You know what the two things are. One is price controlled, imposed during a period of recession, locked in with a very low rate of return, and so forth, and preventing new plants from being built, new cement plants. And second, the environmentalists who are worrying about the pollution caused by cement plants, leading to a closing down of a lot of the old cement plants and decreasing the supply. So we're also, of course, another thing is the final sort of icing of the cake is the cement factories tend to use a lot of natural gas as fuel, and there's a big natural gas shortage caused by the government's price regulation, so forth. There's all things. One thing about the market is everything impinges on everything else. All right. I come now to a couple of special areas of price control, which, apart from the current disaster, there are certain areas of price control which have been going on for many years, and where we have shortages sort of almost as a permanent fact of life in America, and almost accepted as such, because people really, we've gotten to this point, don't know any better. There is, for example, in New York City, we have a special, it blazed the path on a special permanent shortage, which most of the public doesn't know about in America, and that's an apartment shortage. You can't find apartments very easily, if at all. The apartment shortage in Manhattan, the chronic apartment shortage, has been going on since about approximately 1940, came in, not coincidentally, with the rent control law, which was passed at the same time. New York City is one of the few cities in America that has rent control. I think there are a few others that, in a benighted fashion, just put it in again last year. But in all the other cities in the country removed it at the end of World War II. We kept it, continued on with it. The result of rent control, again, is during an inflationary period, so the demand curve keeps going up and the free market rents keep going up. The government then decrees the rents shall remain the same, let's say, as it has been before. This means over the years, as the demand curve keeps going up because of inflation, and the rent is frozen at the old rate, the gap between demand and supply keeps increasing. The apartment shortage, in other words, the shortage of apartment space, which is what's being sold on the rent market, keeps increasing and being aggravated. Well, what happened was that before, I like to tell a story. This is a story which I tell my kids, which I'm sure is not going to be repeated in our lifetime. And I told my students the story about the queuing up behind the butcher's shop. And I'm pretty sure that is going to be repeated. But the other story, I'm afraid, is not going to be repeated. And that's the story of New York City in the golden age before 1940, when everybody moved every year. I mean, it's an incredible situation. Every year there was a one-year lease, and October the 1st, for some reason, the lease was up. And Ma, where are we moving this year? Well, I think we'll move 3 blocks down and 2 blocks over. And it was a magnificent and beautiful thing. There were vacancies all over the place, at every income level and every size apartment. It was just great, just terrific. And people moved every year. And so every October the 1st, the moving vans, the whole streets were clogged with moving vans, moving from one apartment to the other. Immediately, bingo, comes the rent control law, and bingo, the disappearance of the great October 1st moving fest. Nobody moves anymore. I mean, it's a very, very rare event. And the knowledge of this, has disappeared from New York life. And of course, the excuse given by the establishment was, well, of course, there's a apartment shortage because population is going up. Well, first place, population did not suddenly go up on November 1st, 1940, or whatever the date was passed. The second place, population in New York City is not going up. It's remained about the same for about 20 or 30 years, the same 7 point X million, whatever it is. It's really remained remarkably constant. So again, we see the old control devil at work. What happened was that after 1947, I think it was, and there are other people much more expert in this area than I am here tonight. What happens is that the politicians in their wisdom look around, they find out there's no new houses being built, no new apartment houses. Hey, this is kind of a peculiar thing. During the 20s and 30s, lots of apartment houses are being built. How come here we are in a big post-World War II boom? There ain't no houses being built. And it dawned on them that maybe there's some relationship between heavy rent control and the big holding the rents below the free market rate and the fact that no new houses are being built. It is, by the way, much easier to get across to the public the idea that price control will cause a drop of future supply. That's not too difficult to get over. The really difficult thing to get over is that even given the supply, price control below the market price causes shortages and misallocations. So that's much more difficult to get over. But the idea that no new stuff will be built is fairly easy to comprehend, apparently. So what happened is the administration at the time decided, here's what we'll do. We'll induce new housing to come in by having a free market in new houses, no rent control for new housing. Of course, there's no rent control at all for office buildings either, thus causing one of the biggest office building boom probably in the history of the world in the last 20 years, that everybody should turn to this 40-story monster. So we'll have free market for new apartment houses and keep the old rent control in the old apartment houses. So all of a sudden, the New York City housing market was split in two. It was bifurcated. Markets are usually interconnected. So now we had the old housing market. We still have the big shortage going bigger and bigger for old apartment buildings. It means old apartment buildings built before 1947, and new apartment buildings with a free market. And the result of this was, since the people couldn't find the old apartments, this increased the demand curve. It's like substitutes. We now have two markets. This increased the demand curve for new houses, for new apartments. Just like shutting off natural gas and putting a maximum price control on that, increased the demand curve for heating oil. So this means it's increased the demand curve for new apartments, and this meant that the free market rent for the new apartments was much higher than it would have been without the rent control system. You have this huge gap. You have a situation where for example, an old 8-room apartment on West End Avenue was very sturdily built like a fortress with large rooms and so forth, would be going into something like $125 a month. On the other hand, a new building built in a rather jerry-built fashion on First Avenue or something. A 3-room apartment where you can hear the person down the hall turn the light switch. This goes for $500 a month or something like that. You have this enormous and crazy disparities between rents because the demand was was channeled into these new apartments. And of course, then people think that, well, if we eliminate rent control in the old apartments, then the rents will skyrocket up to what it is in the new apartments, First Avenue or something. It's not true. What would happen would be a rise in the rents in the old apartments and a fall in the rents in the new apartments. There would be an equalization tendency towards. In other words, going back to the old one housing market, interconnected market before this split. What happened is, so this continued on. It's pegged along, and more or less in this fashion. Oh, by the way, one of the things that happened, one of the ways in which the housing shortages was manifest, an apartment shortage, is that you have things like queuing up, the equivalent of queuing up, favoritism, black market. All these things show up in New York City apartments. For example, queuing up, you go on the waiting list. For example, in the building in which I live, which happens to be one of these old wall buildings or old building types, if you want to move to a 7-room apartment, let's say, you have to go on a long waiting list, 3-year waiting list or something like that. The point is, what moves you up to the head of the waiting list? Well, the Lord knows. From the lap of the gods. If, however, you happen to be a brother-in-law of the landlord or a friend of the landlord, or if a certain amount of money changes hands, either with the super or the landlord, the super then becomes sort of his own, he begins to allocate the property. Then you go up, you shoot up on the waiting list. This often tends to happen. You also have a situation where, Well, for example, this happened in France, the famous juvenile study of rent control in France. The same sort of thing was happening here to a lesser extent. In France, everything was much more aggravated. You begin to haunt the funeral parlors and people turn into ghouls, in other words. For example, just as sort of an instance of this, a friend of mine who, how should we say, is sort of lacking in good taste and refinement anyway, called me up very excitedly one day, I think it was a Saturday afternoon or something like that, and said, hey, it's a fantastic thing, this old opera singer has died in an 8-room apartment on Broadway, because there was an article about her in the Times, and apparently she died, she lived in an 8-room apartment, and she wasn't married or anything, nobody else living there, and he's going to rush over in an hour and grab the apartment, buy the apartment from the super or whatever the transaction is going to be. So he rushed over there, as I say, not hampered by refinement. Rushed over there. He found out about 5 couples were ahead of him. He was way down the list. So ghoulishness, comes to the fore. You haunt who died, an hour ago, what apartment they have, and you rush over. And Paris apparently has the regular systematic kind of thing where you not only put a super on or a landlord on a retainer, you put the funeral parlors on a retainer. So the funeral director, as the coffin comes in or the corpse comes in, check up, call you up, give you the quick call, tell you about the apartment. You just opened up. So this sort of rather unhealthy, I think we all agree, kind of system is generated by the rent control process. There's also, I say, the black market, and one of the common customs on the west side of Manhattan, which is sort of the key, probably the biggest gap in the country between the pre-market price and the rent control price. You put the super on a retainer. You go on various buildings, you put the super on a retainer and say, call me up and stuff. That's sort of very common practice. One of the things that happens is that the people get locked in. If you happen to be in this rent control apartment and the gap keeps increasing because of inflation, here you are, you're sort of locked in at something like serfdom. So what you have, typically on the west side of Manhattan, you have the following kind of scenario, as they say. A couple moving with 2 or 3 kids moves into an 8-room apartment in Central Park West, West End Avenue in the 1930s when the apartment was, $85 a month. And then what happens is they decided, to complete the story, they decided the city decided, well, we can't leave the rents exactly at 1940 levels. It's a little too much, a little too blatant. So we'll allow a 15% increase every time somebody moves out and some other family moves in. You can imagine what happens then, the economic analysis of that. Then you have a fantastic class struggle is initiated between the landlords trying to get the tenant out and another tenant in because 15% rise every time you do that, and the tenant tries to stay in. So this, instead of the landlord courting the tenant and trying to get more tenants in or trying to keep the tenant there when he is in and painting and all that and improving the amenities of the place, the landlord's trying to get the old tenant out, improve the amenities for the new tenant, and then get the new tenant out, and constant reshuffle, so you can get somewhere up to the free market price. But anyway, in the situation of the couple with three kids, moving in the 1930s at $85 a month, so the rent goes up a little bit, but the couple stays in. They're locked in. The children grow up and move away. The husband dies, and you have a little old widow, an 8-room apartment paying $120 a month. The free market rate is something like $500. So and the thing is, the widow can't move because if she moves any other apartment, say in a new building, available apartment would be like 1 room for $300 a month, something like that. So the little old lady is locked in. You have this fantastic, what's known as space hoarding, so to speak. Certainly not her fault. I think that's the situation. Whereas younger couples getting married or new people coming in from out of town have to go to the Park Avenue, the First Avenue apartment, and pay the $400 for the 2 rooms. So you have this tremendous misallocation of where a new family, just because they're newly arrived on the scene, get penalized, whereas an old family it's like serfdom. An old family got the seniority and you're there forever. Another thing that happens, another peculiar and bizarre thing here is that what the rent is purely depends on whether the person, how many times people have moved in and out. So you can have on the same house, the floor above and the floor below, you can have the same apartment, one going for $85 a month and the other going for $400, depending on how many times people have moved out. If you have the serfdom situation, the little old lady still hanging on, you have a very low price. The other hand, if people have moved in and out a lot, to have a much, much higher price. Really insane kind of housing allocation. I mean, nobody can possibly defend this in any kind of economic principle. So, again, of course, the result of rent control. What happened then was, in the late 60s, I think it was, I forget now, it was around the middle of the late 60s, the New York City government, in its wisdom, passed a new improved zoning law. The zoning laws are always designed to help the public and give fresh air and grass and everything, all that sort of nonsense to the sweltering New York City masses. And each time, of course, they do that, they impose drastic restrictions on how much can be built. There have to be setbacks every few feet. As a result, this cuts down the supply of new houses. This, of course, is not taken into consideration, presumably, by the city planners. So, because you might, if you could only build a building with, with almost all the lot, a very expensive lot taken up with grass or something, you might have beautifully grassy buildings. On the other hand, you might not have too many buildings at all as a result of this imposition. So anyway, so the real estate business was given several years grace and several years warning. The zoning law is going to go into effect in a few years. And so, of course, there was a fantastic rush to build buildings quickly, build new apartment buildings, to get in before the crazy zoning law comes in, when the whole housing market will be clobbered forevermore. So there's this big bulge, a sudden bulge in the mid-60s, and supply curve to the right in new houses, new apartments. As a result, for the first and probably last time in the history of New York City, we had a fall in rents in new buildings. It was almost back to the golden age of the 1930s. Not quite, but it was sort of a trailing clouds of glory from the past. For example, during the 1930s, the way you cut rents, you don't start off by cutting rents, because that's pretty drastic. What you do is you offer concessions. In other words, you offer 1 month or 2 months or 3 months free rent for the person to move in and sign a 2 or 3 year lease. So this is a form of rent cut, but it's not a sort of an official form. You can retract the concession much more easily. You can jack the price up again. So they started offering, new buildings were offering concessions, rental concessions for the first time since the 1930s. It was a beautiful thing to watch. There are actually vacancies and signs, vacancy signs instead of the old under the table bribes, that sort of stuff. Well, of course, this was only a temporary bonanza, because then comes the zoning law, and bingo, the supply of new houses falls to almost zero, and that means the supply curve of new houses shifts to the left, and very suddenly. And in other words, a result of this zoning law kind of situation. So the result of this is that when the leases come up, 2-3 year leases come up for the post-1947 housing, all of a sudden the free market price is going way up. In other words, because of this bulge, and then bulge the other way after the zoning law went into effect. As a result of the new tenants, the new building tenants, were asked for a very hefty rent increase on the landlords, 50% in some cases, 30% or whatever. So hysteria then hit. And of course, the free market was blamed for this. You see, if you have a free market in houses, the landlords will gouge you and raise the rents infinitely and all that sort of thing. All that nonsense. You can't trust the market, and the new building tenants, many of whom were quite wealthy, of course. I mean, there's a sort of a knee-jerk response that tenants are always poor and landlords are always wealthy. So that's a lot of nonsense. There are lots of little old ladies who have like one apartment building, an apartment building with 2 families. They'll get small income out of it. And there are lots of very, very wealthy tenants. Nelson Rockefeller used to be a tenant before the Park Avenue building went co-op. So you don't have to really bleed for the tenant per se. So the tenants put enormous pressure on the city government to do something about this. And city government responding, put on rent control on new buildings for the first time since 1947. So now we have two different types of rent control. We have the old law rent control, the pre-47, the really rugged one, and you have a peculiar thing called rent stabilization for the new buildings, where you're allowed 15%, maximum 15% increase per year or something like that. So, of course, the result of this was to totally clobber new residential buildings. And who in blazes, if you're in the building construction business, who would build a residential building at all now, when you can just as easily build an office building and know that you're going to be free from rent control forevermore? In contrast, so, well, finally, in 1971, a little bit of sanity hit the housing situation when the famous Urstadt report was issued. The New York State Housing Commissioner, Charles Urstadt, who said, well, really the whole problem of apartment shortage in New York City is the rent control. And I guess he would have liked to have gotten rid of rent control altogether. That was politically impossible. So he pushed through the legislature the so-called vacancy control law, which vacancy decontrol law, which decontrols apartments as soon as they become empty. Of course, and continues the old price rent 15% or whatever, some other formula, continues the old severe rent control if the tenant stays in there. Of course, this sets up a fantastic class struggle. Because that means if you're able to kick the tenant out, the whole thing, you go up to the free market rent. If the tenant clings there for dear life, he stays there, he or she stays there at 40%, 50% below. So as a result, they pass all sorts of laws, special hotline, housing bureaus would stay open 24 hours a day or something and make sure, call up whenever the landlord dumps garbage in your window, whatever it is. So, well, what happened, this has not really been tested very well, because as soon as, the law was only into effect, the vacancy control law was only in effect for about 2 months when President Nixon passes his freeze. And then federal rent controls came in, and then everything got messed up. I'm not really sure what's going on. I think now, for the last 6 months or a year or so, the state vacancy decontrol law has been in use, in practice. I don't know the effect of it, except there's a lot of hysteria to eliminate it altogether and go back to the old rent control, which is essentially the current situation. So anyway, we've managed to have because of wartime, the rent shortage, of course, was blamed on wartime as well as population. The war has been over now. World War II has been over for, almost 30 years, and the emergency rent control still remains in force. And of course, the shortage remains in force. All right, there are other areas where, well, I mentioned France also, in passing. Bertrand de Jouvenel wrote an excellent little pamphlet on rent control in France, particularly in Paris. And he wrote it in 1948, and apparently the situation is more or less the same now. And he got the same sort of situation, except more severe, where rents remain not too much higher than they were in 1914, and prices are astronomically higher. And so a wealthy person, for example, might pay 1% of his income in rent, or $1 a month or something like that for rent. I mean, the whole thing, as a result of this, you can't rent any apartment at all. You buy an apartment, which incidentally is happening in West Side of Manhattan also, where the building goes co-op, in quotes, so that instead of renting an apartment, you have to buy it. The result of this gets completely out from under the rent control law. There's no price control on co-ops, on buying the whole apartment. So that means there's plenty of apartments available if you have the money to buy it. So here rent control originally is supposed to come in to help out the poor tenant. Now we're getting more and more in a situation where the only time you can be a tenant, so to speak, is when you're not a tenant, when you got the scratch to buy the whole apartment. Which is a rather peculiar kind of reverse effect. At any rate, coming on to, and I should say also that in Europe, rent control is very severe. Scandinavian countries and France, and Israel, and so forth, as a result of which the apartment shortage is very severe. It's correspondingly severe. There are other areas where it's not quite as obvious, where price control does its work in causing shortages. For example, we've had a problem for quite a few years of airport congestion, particularly at peak hours. And here I commend your attention to an excellent pamphlet on called Airports and Congestion, something like that, by Ross Eckert, put out by the American Enterprise Institute. What happens is, so what you have is a shortage of airspace there on the airport. All right, so what's going on here? Why is there a shortage? Well, again, of course, we always look for government. In the case of airports are universally owned by municipal government. Apparently, it's become part of the American heritage that you can't have a private commercial airport. I understand that Pan Am, a friend of mine works for Pan Am, so Pan Am several years ago tried to get permission from New York City to build its own airport in the New York area, which would have relieved congestion, which would, etc., for its own planes, was denied as being evil, immoral, whatever. So the tradition is going up. You have to have government-controlled airport. Now, the government as we'll see later, as we get to government in general, as they see what keeps sniping away at government throughout, and as we get along, we'll integrate it more and more. Government has no particular reason for maximizing profits. We'll try to get to maximizing profits today too, or operating efficiently or anything of that sort. Their pricing is, they price them whatever the way they want to for political reasons, because whatever happens, the taxpayer is going to pick up the tab if there are any deficits. There's no competition. So the way what happens is the airports have priced their services in a really bizarre way, which no private airport would ever do. The problem comes in the fact that the prices, the big shortage in the runways. And the problem comes in the fact that the price of the runway, in other words, the landing fee and the takeoff fee, is extraordinarily low. It's something like a $5 per landing. And it's equal for every plane that comes in, whether it's a 300-passenger airliner or a private plane zooming in with one person in it. And it's equal for the time of day. It doesn't matter whether it's rush hour or midnight. So the result of all this is that the demand for airport runways is much higher in the rush hour periods, and would be much higher. I mean, certainly Pan Am would be willing to pay a lot more than Joe Blow with his private plane for a landing. The result of that is to fantastically push the price of runways way, way below the free market price and cause congestion in these points. And it also means, and how do you ration shortages, this kind of shortage? You ration by queuing up, in this case. So queuing up, of course, in the airlines is stacking up. So the Pan Am circles for an hour, so the two private planes that happen to get there first. It's like a line. You can't reserve your space. Pan Am can't say, I reserve runway 5 of Kennedy Airport at 5 o'clock. No, you take your chances. And if you get there, if it happens to be two private planes zooming in ahead of you, it's just tough luck. So this sort of, here we have a system of congestion being a shortage of space, brought about by this crazy pricing policy, keeping airport runways way below the market price. The Eckert pamphlet goes into a whole discussion of what happened, for example, when Kennedy Airport, I think, raised its price for its landing fees from something like $5 to something like $25. And really, $25 is pretty small too. But yet, just this little increase pushed out, enormously relieved congestion, because it pushed out a lot of the private planes that wouldn't pay. I mean, you think, after all, if a guy has a private plane, he's pretty rich. But still in all, that extra $20 was stuck in his craw, and they tended to shift from Kennedy Airport to the little airports in Westchester, etc., which was designed for private planes, which is supposed to handle these people. But of course, who wants to land in Westchester when you can land at Kennedy and nip into Manhattan very quickly? But that extra $20 was apparently a good incentive not to do that, to spend $5 to land in Westchester. So just that, and that with hardly a market-clearing price increase, but that itself was a point of the way. Also, of course, the idea of charging passengers, for example, higher fares in rush hours than in off hours, is an intelligent thing, and would help the problem too. However, the really guts of the thing is the runway caper, which is still way below the free market level. And what happens is that since Pan Am is much more willing to pay, say, $100 even than a single person pleasure of flying on Sunday or any other time, the pleasure flyer will go up to Westchester and have and take longer to come into the city. In the meantime, while they're doing this, the airports also have another peculiar pricing system. They give monopoly concessions to the concessionaires. The concessionaires then charge monopoly prices. So there's a whole study been done, for example, the price of a sandwich at an airport restaurant and a comparable restaurant very close by. If you get sort of and the airport sandwich is a much higher price, probably also poorer in quality, although it's difficult for a scholar to gauge. But so the point is, you have the monopoly concession. The concessionaire charges a monopoly price, and the concessionaire shares the monopoly gain with the airport. In other words, the airport is sort of like a kickback to the airport itself. And the airport expects to get most of its money to recoup, to break even or make money from the concessionaires. And whatever it fails to, whatever deficits it has in the concessionaire business, that's what it charges for the runways. Instead of charging a market clearing price for the runways. It simply charges as little as it can, what the customers have left over after they've been stocked for the crummy sandwiches. So, and the insurance, and there are all sorts of concessions in airports which are designed to charge monopoly prices. Again, if we have private airports, there's no reason why we can't have private airports. This sort of pricing system would not be going on. There's another, of course, very prominent form of shortage and congestion, even more prominent than the airports, and that's traffic congestion in big cities. Rush hour, New York City is getting to the point where any hour Manhattan is congested. Well, what you have again is a shortage of traffic, a shortage of street space. And of course, this is not unrelated to the fact that the owners of the streets, invariably and everywhere, are government. How does government price the streets? Well, they price them in a very irrational manner, let's put it that way. Not in a market-clearing manner. If they did, there wouldn't be a constant congestion. The pricing, the government excuse is that that's all right. They're pricing by the user tax on gasoline. So the tax you pay per gallon of gasoline goes for the highways and all that sort of stuff. So it all balances out. In the first place, it doesn't really balance out. But aside from that, the point is you're spending as much money then to drive. It costs you as much to drive around Upper Westchester at 3 a.m. as it does to drive around Midtown Manhattan at 5 p.m. So the fact that you're spending money per gallon doesn't really mean a darn thing. It's not a market clearing kind of price. No private street owner in his right mind would ever price in that manner. So what kind of pricing would they be? Well, obviously we can't predict in detail how the market would operate, but obviously it'd be in a way to charge more money for congested streets than for non-congested streets, for outlying areas. There can be all sorts of devices to do this. There's various economists, by the way, even non-market economists have gotten interested in this area as sort of an intellectual game. How could this operate? Come up with interesting suggestions. One way is to have a special sticker, like a license. So instead of having just a regular license, you have the sticker on the window or whatever, which you have to pay for either per week or per month or per day, whatever, can be always adjusted, which would be very expensive and allow you to drive around the Midtown area from 4 to 6 or something like that. And the price would be charged in a market clearing manner. The same thing can be done for parking. The parking fees, of course, parking is again mostly handled by government, and street parking certainly. And parking fees are very peculiar. They're invariably way underpriced, way below the free market price. And as a result, there's a big parking space shortage. Plus the fact that they're priced in a peculiar way, so that very often they're priced in such a way that you're subsidized for spending more time there. In other words, if you park for 4 hours, it costs you less per hour than if you park for a half hour. Of course, if you want to have a high turnover and clear the market for parking, you should do just the opposite. You charge more for a longer period and try to induce the guy to get out so the new car can come in. The governments almost never do that. So what you would have, and the thing is, what the government does, and this is typical government activity, either they subsidize the parking so the price is zero in effect, almost virtually zero for street space, so you have tremendous congestion. And then, or they say, well, what we have to do, there's no getting around, we have to ban all cars from Manhattan, or from Midtown Manhattan, prohibit them, stop them, shoot anybody who comes in the 42nd Street. It's a typical government kind of activity, where either something is free, either you subsidize it so it's completely free, or else you prohibit it altogether. Obviously, what the market would do, if the market were allowed in this situation, is to gauge this thing and price it, and set the price in such a way as to clear the market, and everybody would be happy. There'd be no shortage of parking space. It'd be fairly expensive, perhaps, but that's the way it should be, since that would be allocating the scarce space for the intense demand. I don't know what the price, of course, would be, but it would be somewhere, it would be somewhere in between zero and being prohibited. So someday, if we ever get this kind of market pricing, if we ever get private streets, we will get market pricing. The funny thing is, most people think of the onus, if somebody advocates privately owned streets, that the assumption is that the government is operating streets so beautifully that the onus on proving that the market can handle it is on the person who advocates the market alternative. It seems to me it should be just the opposite. Certainly in New York City, the streets are miserable.
dirty, littered, and congested, and difficult to see how any private street company can do any worse. So just on empirical grounds, one would think they would try it. So we should tend to look then at things, not just sort of obvious things like nails and cement, where shortages can be caused by price control, also in these sort of hidden areas where people don't think in terms of prices, such as airport space, such as traffic space, and so forth. We'll get later on. We'll get on to questions of conservation. Go back to the whole thing about scarce capital and scarce natural resources too, and also the whole question of private property in general in different hidden areas, so to speak. We'll get to later on the whole things of private property areas where nobody thinks in terms of private property, such as radio, TV channels. We'll get to that later on.